chapter 4. And this morning we're going to be looking in particular for a short time together the last few verses, verse 16 to verse 18. And we will then roll over a little bit to the beginning of chapter 5 as well. Now, verse 16 begins with some really encouraging words. And indeed, there's a great deal of encouragement in this letter. The way I'm approaching it at the moment over these next few weeks is to look in particular at the pastoral encouragements, the pastoral applications from this wonderful letter. And verse 16 begins with these words, "Therefore we do not lose heart." So really our first point this morning is why we do not lose heart. It's a great thing, isn't it? What Paul is saying here, he's not just saying about himself, but he's saying about all Christians. Therefore, we do not lose heart. He has a great deal to say in this letter, which is in the first person, me, I, myself. But he also switches sometimes to speak of things which are true of all Christians. And as he speaks here about not losing heart, he's speaking about the experience and the confidence that is to be in all Christians everywhere. Now, losing heart is really very unpleasant experience, isn't it? It basically means giving up, feeling overwhelmed, feeling under so much pressure or so dispirited or disillusioned that in the end you say, well, what's the point? I just can't do this anymore. I can't keep going. And Paul says that despite his difficulties, and our difficulties as God's people, whether they're personal difficulties or difficulties that come as a result of living in ours at the moment with the coronavirus, we do not lose heart. That's a very bold thing to say, isn't it? Very bold. So why is it that Paul can make this claim? That ultimately, whatever we may be facing, Christians do not lose heart. Losing heart rarely happens suddenly, by the way. It's usually part of a long process. Doubt starts to creep into your mind. Concerns start to arise. Fears start to arise. And over that period of time, they begin to get the better of us. I was trying to think of an illustration for you, and some of you know that before my injuries really hit home, I used to enjoy running marathons and ultra marathons. These are very long, particularly if you ran as slowly as I did. They could be very long occasions sometimes. And in every race I ran, I always began with the intention that whatever happens, I am determined not to walk. I'm going to run the 26.2 miles, if it was a marathon, and I'm going to run it all to the very end. I have to confess this morning that there was never a marathon where I didn't end up walking. And in the end, I actually developed a run-walk strategy deliberately because of that. But as I was thinking about this business of losing heart and the fact that it's not a sudden thing, invariably it's almost always part of a long process of wearing down. I was reminded of the battles that used to go on in my mind and inside of me. As I sought to resist the impulse to walk in a marathon, it would be a long internal battle. Can I keep going to the next water station? Just keep going to the next mile. Just keep going for the next song that you're listening to. Keep going to the next lamppost. You play these tricks all the time to try and keep yourself going, but fatigue and the biggest thing, self-doubt and why am I doing this to myself? Those big thoughts began to get the better of me as I lost sight of my great goal. Now for Paul, writing this, to lose heart is not a theoretical thing. He faced very great temptation to do this. He began the section in chapter 4, as you may remember, with precisely the same words in verse 1. Therefore, since through God's mercy we have this ministry, we do not lose heart. But the ministry that causes Paul not to lose heart is the very same thing that sometimes was simply too much for him to bear. And here in this letter, perhaps of all the letters that Paul writes, he presents us with some very dark moments, honestly and frankly. If we flick back to the first chapter and to verses 8 and 9, he says, "We do not want you to be uninformed, brothers, about the hardships we suffered in the province of Asia. We were under great pressure, far beyond our ability to endure, so that we despaired even of life. Indeed, in our hearts, we felt the sentence of death. But this happened that we might not rely on ourselves, but on God, who raises the dead." But Paul's point is clear. We were under great pressure, beyond our ability to endure. And the pressure was so great, he says, we despaired even of life, and we felt in our hearts the sentence of death, overwhelmed by trouble. If we were to jump on to the 6th chapter and verses 4 and 5, Paul actually tells us some of those hardships. He speaks about troubles, hardships and distresses in beatings, imprisonments, riots, hard work, sleepless nights, hunger. Those are very real distressing events and stressors, aren't they? All of these things threaten the stability, Paul tells us, of his heart. In our hearts, we felt the sentence of death. Now, losing heart and subsequently giving up for Paul would have meant disobeying the call God had placed on his life, that is, to be an apostle, particularly to the Gentiles. It would have been disastrous. But for you, losing heart can have different consequences. But the challenge, it still remains very real. Generally for us, if we lose heart as Christians, it might mean withdrawing from our active engagement or commitment to the life of a local church. We begin to withdraw from people. Why? Because everything's too much for us. Maybe there are things that have gone on in our lives and we say, why has God allowed that? And that sort of question begins to dominate and bring our hearts low. And left unchecked, we may very easily fall into cynicism, despair, and even resentment and bitterness. It's little wonder, whilst Paul has identified here that the issue was what was going on in his heart, that we read in the Old Testament, in the book of Proverbs, chapter 4 and verse 23, that we are above all else guard your heart, for it is the wellspring of life. So if our hearts are filled with despair, if we feel the sentence of death, as Paul put it, in our hearts, if everything has got too much for us and it affects us internally, then it is a very serious thing. Perhaps your and my greatest struggle as Christians is with our hearts. And central to this struggle is the measure of our faith in God, the awareness of his promises, and the reality of his faithfulness. Now, this is why immediately after the words in our passage in verse 16, we do not lose heart, immediately after writing that, Paul goes on to write in the second part of that verse, though outwardly we're wasting away, yet inwardly we're being renewed day by day. Paul presents to us a fascinating tension, and it's a reminder of how we are composed as human beings. We have a body, but we also have a mind and a soul, and it seems that those latter things are encapsulated in this word heart. So Paul says there's the outward aspect of our lives, which may not be looking very healthy or strong. It may be really in difficulty, as he says here, wasting away. And yet at the very same time, inwardly, in our hearts, we can find ourselves being renewed and getting stronger day by day. This, by the way, is a major biblical theme. For example, in the calling of David into the service of God as the little shepherd boy. All his brothers were much older and bigger and stronger, more handsome possibly, more impressive. But when it comes to the moment to anoint the king in waiting for Israel, Samuel goes through all of those brothers, and to each one God says no, until they finally say, well, there is one other. And he's just a little kid and he's out in the fields looking after some sheep, and they bring him in and Samuel anoints him because God says this is the man. And it's in that context that we get these words. People look on the outward appearance, but God looks on the heart. We're a culture which is obsessed with the outward appearance, with the airbrushing of pictures for Instagram or wherever you want to put them on social media, for presenting a front, to only communicating on social media the good things about you, the positive things about you, the impressive things about you. We try to present an image. And yet everybody knows that deep down inside things are always very different. Paul is telling us here that as Christians we may struggle in terms of what people see of us on the outside and what may be happening to us in terms of our living in this world. But whatever is happening, there is always this encouragement that however bleak it is, we may be renewed inwardly every day. Now, we've got to be careful with this. We mustn't go overboard on the heart, because again in the Old Testament we're told that the heart is deceitful above all things and beyond cure. Who can know it? But Paul here is speaking not in a general sense about every human being struggle with the external, internal. He's saying there is something unique to the Christian here. That is the person with a new heart, a renewed heart. Again from the Old Testament, in the book of Ezekiel, we read God promising, I will give you a new heart and put a new spirit in you. The Christian has received that when they put their faith and trust in the Lord Jesus. It's the reminder that becoming a Christian and living as a Christian is a spiritual thing. At the moment, we can't enter into our building to join together for Sunday morning worship. That's sad. It's burdensome. It's not great. But it's not the end of everything. Why? Because we don't depend on being in a pile of bricks once a week to somehow be a Christian. No, there is this living daily dynamic of the Spirit of God working within us. So verse 16 reminds us that though outwardly things may look grim, but they can be very different from what's going on inside. Lovely illustration of this was there was a great Welsh preacher in the 20th century, Martin Lloyd-Jones, from Tregaron, not that far really from us here in Llanelli. There was a great Scottish preacher called Robert Murray McShane. He died a very young man, but although he was only in ministry for a limited number of years, he had a huge impact for good on the community where he ministered. And speaking of his own heart, and this was a man who was legendary for his Christ-likeness, his godly living, his cheerful spirit, and his desire to serve as Christ would have him serve. He wrote once about the struggles he knew inwardly. "I am tempted to think that I am now an established Christian, that I have overcome this or that lust so long that I have got into the habit of the opposite grace, so that there's no fear. I may venture very near the temptation, nearer than other men." This is a lie of Satan. One might as well speak of gunpowder getting by habit of resisting fire so as not to catch spark. As long as powder is wet, it resists the spark. And when it becomes dry, it's ready to explode. As long as the Spirit dwells in my heart, he deadens me to sin, so that if lawfully called into temptation, I may reckon upon God carrying me through. But when the Spirit leaves me, I'm like dry gunpowder. Guarding and nurturing your heart has to be a great preoccupation of the Christian believer. But how is that done? Well, the work of renewing and being renewed every day is a work of the Holy Spirit within the Christian. And this is why it's important to seek regular times of refreshing of our souls in the presence and in the promises of God. Years ago, people used to speak about the importance of having a daily quiet time. Now, and I quite like this phrase, seems to have replaced it, the importance of daily soul work. Time when you refresh yourself in the truth of what God has said and find comfort and strength in it. This is a spiritual discipline, and it's very important. Well, Paul at the beginning of the chapter spoke about not losing heart, and he said that was because of the ministry that God had given him. He had such a high view of it. But now in verse 16, he really begins to unpack the reasons why Christians do not and should not lose heart. Which brings us to our second big thing here this morning, which is why trouble really should never have the last word on a Christian. See, Paul really does know about trouble. If we go to chapter 11 and verses 23 to 29, we have a huge long passage there where he really unpacks his troubles in great difficulties. He says, "I've worked much harder, been in prison more frequently, been flogged more severely, been exposed to death again and again. 5 times I received from the Jews the 40 lashes minus 1. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was stoned. 3 times I was shipwrecked. I spent a night and a day in the open sea. I've been constantly on the move, in danger from rivers, from bandits, from my own countrymen, from Gentiles, in danger in the city, in the country, in danger at sea, in danger from false brothers. I have often gone without sleep. I've known hunger and thirst, and often gone without food. I've been cold and naked. And apart from this, I every day face the pressure of my concern for all the churches." Paul knew what it was to experience overwork, sleep deprivation, physical pain, fear, danger, anxiety, and his own inward struggles with temptation. But here in verse 17, he refers to all of his troubles as being light and momentary. Now, how can the troubles that we've just looked at there ever be considered light and momentary? Light, not so bad. Momentary, well, passing. And of course the truth is you can only consider your own particular context of troubles of being like that when you're able to compare them to something else that's better. Maybe the pain of childbirth, which is really profound, but then eclipsed in the birth of the child and the placing of that child in a new mother's arms. The pain and suffering of an ultramarathon can be eclipsed a short while afterwards. And you receive the medal and you know you've completed the distance. So what is the thing that Paul is comparing his light and his troubles with so that he can call them light and momentary? Well, verse 17, he tells us that these troubles are achieving for us an eternal glory that far outweighs them all. This is very similar to what Paul wrote in another letter to the Romans in chapter 8 and verse 18, where there he says, I consider that our present sufferings are not worth comparing with the glory that will be revealed in us. He's looking and considering eternal glory. And he says this eternal glory far outweighs all of my troubles and all of my difficulties. Now, looking carefully at verse 17, we may ask the question, well, how do troubles achieve for us an eternal glory that far outweighs them? And it seems a challenging word there is the word achieve. Does this mean that suffering in this life earns merit in the life to come? That's a Roman Catholic teaching, and actually it's not really something that the Bible teaches and sustains clearly. No, the word translated achieved is usually indicative of a process. So what Paul is saying is that as we pass through suffering and difficulty and troubles in this life, we are moving towards something that when we enter into it, we will consider all of our suffering to be light and momentary. This is the Christian hope. 78 years tomorrow, the writer C.S. Lewis preached a sermon in Oxford. It was during World War II. The sermon was published. It's known as The Weight of Glory. He has some very helpful things to say in that sermon. But one of the things he does is he's, at one point, which is very helpful, is he writes this. When we put on this greater glory, we will understand that the very best in this life was only the first sketch. It's a great illustration, isn't it? Think of the greatest moment in your life, birth of a child, your wedding day, an occasion which is particular to you, running your first marathon or something like that, the celebrations afterwards, the greatest party, the happiest day, the most momentous event that you've experienced in this life. Lewis is quite correctly saying there, that moment, as wonderful as it is in this life, is just the first sketch of what one day we will see as a glorious painting in all of its colour. And in that sermon, The Weight of Glory, he also speaks about how in this life we are living on the wrong side of the door. The wrong side of the door. And that's really helpful to what Paul is saying here. He's pointing to troubles, outward distresses, things that threaten to cause us to lose heart. And all of this is rooted in the suffering and difficulty we experience in this life. But that's only one side of the door. On the other side of the door is this eternal glory that far outweighs our troubles. Now this morning, if you're not yet a Christian, in that you've not yet taken that step of putting your faith in Jesus Christ for the forgiveness of your sins and the receiving of new life, I think C.S. Lewis's sermon is really helpful. It points out that the deepest longings in your life are actually a longing for this glory as you're living the wrong side of the door. He actually writes these words in this sermon, longing to be reunited with something in the universe from which we now feel cut off, to be on the inside of some door which we have always seen from the outside, is no mere neurotic fantasy, but the truest index of our real situation. Can I ask you this morning, is there a sense in your life that there is a longing for more? And however wonderful the experiences you've had in life, of family, success in your work, in education, leisure, the places you've visited in the world, the experiences you've had. As one old hymn writer used to put it like this: none but Christ can satisfy. These things haven't really satisfied. It's exactly what Lewis is saying here. And Paul's reminder that there waits the Christian something glorious. This weight of glory, eternal glory, that outweighs all of our troubles. Don't you long for that? Well, you know you can have that hope. You can have the reality of that promise. You can have a down payment of that glory in your life now, if you will put your life in the hands of the Lord Jesus Christ. Well, third point really this morning as we close then is, well, what exactly is this eternal glory that is so important to Paul as he writes here? That he can say that however big my troubles are, they are but light and momentary in comparison to it. Well, in verse 18, he tells us, as a result of this glory, we fix our eyes on what is not seen, but on what is unseen. You might say, how can you look at something that's unseen? Well, we're always aware of things that are unseen all the time. If I was to jump off this platform, you and I both know what would happen. I'd fall to the ground because of the unseen force of gravity. It's there, it's real. And for Paul, as he writes here, he's telling us as Christians, we don't live our lives just looking at this life. If we did, we really would be very miserable. We would be overwhelmed, perhaps, by what's happening in our world right now. We would be in despair over the failure of humanity to deal with something as fundamental and elementary as care and respect for one another and the development of racism. But Paul says here the Christian doesn't just look at this world. The Christian doesn't just look at their troubles, but they look at what is unseen. And why is this? Well, again in verse 18 he tells us the reason for this, he says, is what is seen is temporary. It's not going to last forever. It's not the end of the story. But what is unseen is eternal. Now he is clearly ultimately speaking here of heaven. He's speaking of the eternal realities of where God is and where God promises to take every single one of his children, every single person who puts their faith and trust in Jesus Christ will know the reality of heaven in all of its fullness and in all of its glory. And Paul said it's the awareness that this life with all of its troubles is not the end, it's not the last word. But wonderfully there is the promise of heaven and the glory of heaven. We're not actually told a massive amount about heaven in the Bible, but I think one of the most touching and wonderful things we're told is found in the last book of the Bible, in the book of Revelation, chapter 21, verse 4, speaking how there God will wipe away every tear from our eyes. There will be no more death, or mourning, or crying, or pain, for the old order of things has passed away. Forever. Sure, certain, eternal, glorious. And that's why if we just flick over to the first verse of the 5th chapter, the next chapter, and pinch a verse from there, we see Paul making these wonderful statements. Now we know that if the earthly tent we live in is destroyed, speaking of the body, we have a building from God, an eternal house in heaven, not built by human hands. The Christian is heading for something glorious, a building from God, an eternal house in heaven. And so wonderful is this, says Paul in the next verse, in verse 2 of chapter 5, we groan, longing to be clothed with our heavenly dwelling. This is the great perspective of Christian living in this world. However good life is, or however terrible life is, this life is not the end. So we fix our eyes not on what is seen, but on what is unseen. But what is seen is temporary, and what is unseen is eternal. And this is the reason the Christian does not lose heart. My loss, my suffering, my despair, my disappointment, it's not the end. It's not the final experiences in life, and then that's it. No, there's something ahead, and it's glorious, and it's wonderful. One modern songwriter, Christian songwriter, puts it very simply and movingly this way: there is a hope that stands the test of time, that lifts my eyes beyond the beckoning grave, to see the matchless beauty of a day divine, when I behold his face. When suffering cease and sorrows die and every longing satisfied, then joy unspeakable will flood my soul. For I am truly home. Truly home. Christian friend, you are not truly home. This is not the end. This life, with all of its challenges and absorbing busyness, is not your home. There is a home, and you're heading for that home. And one day, you will be home. This is why you do not lose heart.